I never imagined that the day I buried my son would be the same day someone tried to erase the life I'd spent nearly 4 decades building. But that's exactly where everything began. Right there in the middle of a funeral reception filled with strained condolences, stale coffee, and the kind of whispered conversations people only have when tragedy makes them uncomfortable. The house was crowded, too warm, too loud, too full of people saying all the wrong things. But still, somehow, I felt completely alone. My son's photo sat on the dining table, framed in black. A reminder, a wound. And just a few feet away, my daughter-in-law, Victoria, stood with her chin high, shoulders back, wearing a dress expensive enough to require its own security guard. And then it happened. She walked toward me with a stiff, professional smile. The kind of smile real estate agents paste on when they're trying to sell you a house with termites in the foundation. She put a perfectly manicured hand on my arm and leaned in just enough to make the hairs on my neck rise. "Tom," she said quietly, "we need to talk about your situation. Your situation." The way she said it, cold, clipped, felt like a diagnosis rather than a conversation. Before I could even respond, she guided me a few steps aside. Not far, just enough so others could pretend not to eavesdrop. Her tone stayed soft, but carried an unmistakable authority. "You've been dependent on David for years," she continued. "And now that he's gone, things need to change. I can't take on that burden." Burden. The word hit me like a shove. I looked at her, really looked at her. The polished hair, the expensive dress, the calculated sympathy etched into her expression, but not even a flicker of grief in her eyes. She straightened the sleeve of her dress. "I've been generous letting you stay here, but now this house is mine, and you'll need to make arrangements to move out." The room suddenly felt smaller. People milled around us, murmuring soft condolences, filling plates with food no one had the appetite for. A neighbor glanced in our direction, then quickly looked away, like she'd overheard enough to know trouble was brewing. Victoria didn't seem to care that we were still at my son's funeral, or that I hadn't even begun processing the shock of losing him. She just kept going. "I found a senior community with an available studio. It's affordable for someone in your situation," she said, slipping a brochure into my hand. 30 days should be enough." She let the words linger, like she expected me to argue. But I didn't. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't protest. I didn't even correct her. My silence made her eyes soften, not with kindness, but with victory. She thought she'd broken me. She thought my quiet meant she was right. She thought her assumptions were facts. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that she'd just stepped onto a battlefield she didn't even realize existed. Because while she was busy planning my eviction, she had absolutely no idea that every brick in this house, every nail, every beam, every memory, belonged to me. That I had built it in 1987 with my own hands. That the money she thought she inherited wasn't his to leave. Victoria didn't know about the downstairs filing cabinet with 4 drawers of proof. She didn't know about the trust. She didn't know about the truth she was about to collide with head first. But that part comes later. Right now, standing there in the warm, crowded room, with the smell of flowers and grief hanging in the air, I just stared at the brochure she'd forced into my hands. 30 days. A studio apartment. A more appropriate living situation. I felt my chest tighten, not with fear, but with something colder, something steadier, something that only wakes up when someone crosses a line so sharply it echoes. And Victoria? She didn't just cross the line. She leaped over it. "Before we continue, Make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from in the comments. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Her voice cut back into my thoughts. This is what David would have wanted, she said confidently. No, it wasn't. My son had his flaws, but cruelty wasn't one of them. I nodded anyway. A small nod. Controlled. Quiet. The kind of nod that only looks like agreement when the other person wants to believe it. Victoria took that nod as surrender. She even placed her hand on my shoulder, lightly, patronizingly, as if she were consoling a child who didn't understand how the world worked. Thank you for being reasonable, she said, her voice syrupy and firm at the same time. This is for the best. Then she walked away. The heels of her shoes clacked across the hardwood floors I had installed myself 27 years ago, and every step sounded like an insult. As the evening winded down, she returned one last time, holding a printed paper, a timeline, a checklist. She'd actually formatted it. Your move-out plan, she said proudly. I folded the paper once, placed it in my jacket pocket, and gave her a gentle smile. A smile she couldn't read, a smile that didn't match what was coming. When the last guest left and the house finally grew quiet, I stood in the dim light of the hallway and looked at the empty spaces on the mantel, spots where Victoria had already removed photos of my wife and my son. She wasn't just pushing me out. She was erasing a family, erasing a history, erasing a life she didn't build but thought she owned. But here's the thing about quiet men. We're not weak. We're watching. And when the time comes, we act. I went to bed that night not defeated, not scared, not broken, just resolute. Because tomorrow would not be the day I moved out. Tomorrow would be the day I began the process of revealing the truth. And Victoria? She had no idea the storm she had invited into her life. That night, after the funeral crowd faded and the house finally went silent, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Sleep didn't come, not even close. My mind ran in slow circles, replaying the moment Victoria handed me that printed eviction timeline like she was awarding me a prize for losing everything. I could still hear her voice echoing in my ears. 30 days, Tom. It's for the best. The best for who? Certainly not for me. Outside, the November wind rattled the gutters, carrying the faint hum of distant traffic. It was one of those cold Midwestern nights where the air feels thin, sharp, like it's trying to keep you awake. So I stopped fighting the insomnia. I got out of bed, pulled on my old gray sweater, and walked down the stairs. Creaking steps, familiar shadows, the soft smell of pine from the wooden banister I'd sanded and stained myself decades ago. I reached the bottom and paused, letting my eyes adjust to the gentle glow of the nightlight in the hallway. Then I turned left, toward the basement door. The handle was cool when I wrapped my hand around it. I pushed it open and felt the first chill of the basement air brushing across my face. I hadn't been down there in months, not since my son's accident, not since grief had turned my days into gray blurs. The stairs moaned with each step as I descended, one hand sliding along the railing I'd installed long before David was born. The basement smelled exactly like I remembered. A mix of old cardboard, concrete, and faint traces of motor oil from the years I'd spent tinkering with tools down here. In the corner sat the workbench, cluttered now, but still standing strong. And then, across the room, stood the filing cabinet. 4 drawers, gray metal, unassuming. But inside, it held the truth Victoria didn't know existed. I approached it slowly, as if it were an old friend I hadn't visited in years. Dust coated the top, soft and undisturbed. I wiped it away with my sleeve and pulled the bottom drawer open. The metal screeched a little. Years of use, years of weight. But it slid open as reliably as always. Inside were folders, each one labeled in my handwriting. Neat, sharp, organized. 1980s, 1990s, 2000 East, 2010s, trust documents. Private. I stared at that last folder for a moment before pulling it out. It felt heavier than I remembered. I carried it to the small wooden table near the wall. A single bulb dangled overhead, casting a circle of warm light that barely pushed back the basement shadows. I sat down, opened the folder, and the memories hit me harder than I expected. The first document, the trust agreement, dated June 15th, 1985. I ran my fingers across the embossed seal. My wife's signature, elegant, steady, was right next to mine. A lump rose in my throat. This trust had been our way of securing a future for our family. Not a gift, not a handout, an investment in stability. Margaret always said, "Prepare now so no one tries to rewrite your life later." And here I was, living proof of how right she'd been. I flipped to the next document, a bank statement. $853,412. Still growing. Still intact. David had benefited from the trust his whole life. We paid for his education, his wedding, even some of the tools he used when he first started building furniture as a hobby. He knew I helped him. He just never explained it to Victoria. Or maybe she never bothered to ask. I leaned back in the chair. Victoria had spent 2 months thinking she'd inherited a fortune, thinking the house was hers, thinking David's finances flowed from him to me. She had never imagined it was the other way around. Closing the folder, I exhaled slowly. This wasn't just about assets or paperwork. It was about boundaries, about dignity, about refusing to be erased from a story I had lived longer than anyone else still standing. I placed the trust documents aside and opened the drawer labeled 1980s. Inside were receipts from the land purchase, construction contracts, the original deed, proof that I had bought and built this place with my own hands and the sweat of my back. I remembered the first day I stood on the empty lot in '87. The dirt beneath my boots, the blueprint rolled under my arm, the excitement buzzing in my chest. My wife had held David's tiny hand as he toddled around, excited to see his new house. He was 5 then, full of energy, full of imagination. We poured the foundation in June, framed the house in July, roofed it in August. It wasn't just a home, it was a legacy. I slid the folder closed and rested my hand on it. Victoria had no clue, not a single clue, but soon she would. I tucked everything back carefully, locked the drawer, and returned upstairs. The kitchen clock read 3:14 a.m. Too early for coffee, too late for sleep. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. My reflection glimmered faintly in the dark window. Older, yes, but not defeated. Victoria thought she was dealing with a frail old man whose life had run out of momentum. But she was wrong. She'd mistaken quiet for weak, grief for confusion, age for dependence. And now that she'd pushed me past the point of tolerance, she was about to learn the difference. The next morning, the sky was overcast, the kind of gray Cleveland mornings are famous for. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, the trust documents laid out in front of me like coordinates for a battle map. I made a list, not of what I'd lost, but of what Victoria thought she had gained. The house, the insurance, the furniture, the memories she tried to erase. She thought she owned it all, but she didn't even own the story she was telling. Halfway through my coffee, A car door slammed outside. I glanced through the window and saw Victoria striding up the walkway. No knock, no courtesy, just the confidence of someone who believed she held the deed to the world. She let herself in using David's old key. "Tom," she called out sharply. "We need to talk." Of course we did. She walked into the kitchen holding a manila folder stuffed with papers. "I've been thinking about your finances," she said, sliding into the chair across from me. "I need to know exactly what David was paying for you so I can prepare a proper budget until you move out." There it was again. Her favorite phrase, "until you move out." I took a slow sip of coffee. "What budget?" She blinked, annoyed that I wasn't falling in line. "For covering the mortgage, utilities, taxes, everything." "And why?" I asked calmly. "Do you believe David paid for all that?" Her pen hovered over her notepad. "Because it's obvious." "Obvious?" I repeated. "Yes, Tom. You're on a fixed income. How else would you manage a house this size?" I set my cup down gently. "Have you ever seen a mortgage statement?" I asked. Her confidence wavered for half a second. "David handled that online. Did you ever see him write a check for property taxes?" She hesitated. "No, but..." "Did he ever tell you he paid them?" Silence. Her eyes darted to the folder in front of her. I leaned forward slightly. "Victoria, you've made assumptions. Dangerous ones." "They're not assumptions," she snapped. "They're facts." I let that hang in the air. Then I watched the flicker in her eyes, that tiny spark of doubt. She buried it quickly, but it was there. "Tom," she said, her voice rising with frustration, "stop pretending you're not dependent on us." "Us." She said it like she represented a whole committee. I stood slowly, walked to the sink, rinsed my cup, and set it upside down to dry. "Victoria," I said quietly, "one day soon, you're going to regret speaking to me this way." She scoffed. "Is that a threat?" "No," I said, turning toward her. "It's a promise that the truth is coming." Her jaw tightened. "Fine. Show me the deed. If you really think this house is yours, prove it." I smiled. Not a happy smile, a knowing one. "Some conversations," I said, "are better had with lawyers present." Her eyes widened just slightly. "What does that mean?" But I didn't answer. I just walked past her, heading toward the door. "Tom, what does that mean?" she repeated, her voice following me. I paused, hand on the doorknob. "It means," I said gently, "you should be very careful about who you call a burden." Then I stepped outside, letting the autumn air wash over me like the first breath of a new beginning. Because the truth wasn't just coming, it was already on its way. The cold November air felt different that morning, sharper, almost cleansing, as if the world itself understood that something was shifting. I walked down the driveway slowly, hands tucked into my jacket pockets, breathing in the quiet calm that Victoria could never seem to create in a room. For the first time since David passed, I felt clarity in my chest instead of grief. Not because I didn't miss my son, but because now there was purpose beneath the sadness. A purpose Victoria herself had awakened. When I reached the end of the driveway, I stopped and looked back at the house. 40 years of life, laughter, arguments, Christmas mornings. And now, a woman who had lived there for less than a decade was trying to throw me out of it. But she didn't know the truth. Not yet. I pulled my phone from my pocket and scrolled to a name I hadn't called in months. Margaret Collins, attorney at law. She wasn't related to my late wife, just a coincidence. But she'd handled my legal and financial matters for nearly 20 years. If there was anyone who understood my documents as well as I did, It was her. I pressed call. She answered on the second ring. Tom, everything all right? No, I said. But it will be. There was a pause, the kind of quiet that meant she'd caught the seriousness in my voice. Do you need me at the office today? I need to come in, with documents. Is this about Victoria? She asked gently. I exhaled. It's time she learns the truth. I'll clear my morning, she said. Bring everything. We'll handle it. I hung up and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The wind picked up, rustling the fallen maple leaves along the curb. The neighborhood looked the same. It always did. But I felt different walking back toward the house. Lighter, stronger, more certain. Grief may change a man, but disrespect awakens him. Inside, Victoria was still at the kitchen table, flipping through her legal pad with irritated energy. She didn't look up when I entered, but I could feel the tension radiating off her like heat from an oven. Property taxes, utilities, medical expenses, she muttered, writing notes as if the world depended on her math. I stepped past her without a word. Where are you going? She finally snapped. Out, I said simply. For what? A meeting. With who? I stopped at the doorway and turned slightly. With someone who understands facts. Her face twitched, just barely, but the crack in her confidence was visible now. She closed her folder, stood up, and crossed her arms. Tom, I don't appreciate the attitude, she said. I raised an eyebrow. No? You're being sarcastic. No, I said softly. I'm being patient. The color drained from her cheeks, but she said nothing. For the first time in weeks, Victoria didn't have a comeback, and I didn't give her time to find one. I walked out the door. At the law office. The waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and lemon cleaner, the same way it always had. Margaret's office had those tall mahogany bookshelves lined with thick legal volumes she actually read, unlike the decorative books Victoria kept on her living room shelf for aesthetic. Margaret looked up from her desk the moment I stepped inside. Tom, she said warmly, sit. Let's go through everything. I placed 3 thick folders on her desk, trust documents, tax records, and the deed, and watched her expression shift from curiosity to approval. Good, she said. This is exactly what we need. She sifted through each document with careful precision, marking pages with sticky tabs. Tom, Victoria has absolutely no legal claim to your house, she said, matter of fact. I know. She also has no claim to the money she thinks she inherited. I know. And I'm assuming she doesn't realize David's life insurance doesn't go to her. She does not. Margaret nodded slowly, in that lawyer way that meant, oh, she's about to have a very, very bad day. Do you want to confront her now? She asked. Today? I took a breath. Not yet. She studied me. Why tomorrow? Because she's comfortable today, I said. Comfortable with her assumptions. Comfortable treating me like a burden. Let her enjoy her fantasy a little longer. Margaret smiled, a small, knowing smile. You've always been strategic, she said. Quiet, but strategic. People underestimate quiet, I replied. It's one of your strengths, she said. So, what's the plan? I leaned forward in my chair. We meet at her office in front of her colleagues. Margaret blinked. You want witnesses? She embarrassed me publicly. You want to embarrass her back? No, I said calmly. I want the truth presented publicly. The rest? That's her consequence, not my revenge. Margaret nodded slowly. All right, I'll arrange it. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. at her brokerage. I reached for my folders, but she stopped me. Leave them, she said. I'll prepare everything tonight. I stood to leave, but she added, Tom, this is justified. She crossed the line. I know, I said, and tomorrow she'll see exactly how far. The next morning. I woke earlier than usual. The sky outside was gray again, heavy with clouds, but my mind was strangely clear. I dressed in my best suit, the same one I'd worn to David's graduation years earlier. It still fit, though the shoulders felt heavier now. At 9:30, I left the house. The same house Victoria believed she owned. I drove slowly, intentionally, letting the hum of the old Honda soothe the parts of me that were still tender with grief. But underneath that grief was newfound certainty. She underestimated the wrong man. When I reached Premier Realty, I saw the usual bustle of agents carrying folders, sipping coffee, laughing too loudly. The glass doors reflected the morning light. Margaret was already waiting outside, holding a neatly organized portfolio. You ready? She asked. Yes. We walked in together. Victoria was at her desk. She looked up and froze when she saw Margaret with me. Tom, what is going on? She asked, her voice losing its practiced steadiness. We need to talk, I said. Privately, she hissed. No, Margaret said. Publicly. Heads turned, conversations quieted. The office energy shifted like someone had turned down the volume on the world. Victoria swallowed. Why would we do this here? Because truth doesn't hide, I said. Her eyes darted between me and Margaret, panic settling in her posture. Tom, she tried again, whispering. Can we please just... No, I said firmly. You silenced me at my son's funeral. Today, you'll listen. Margaret opened her portfolio and laid the first document on the desk. The deed. My name. 1987, no cosigner. Victoria's face drained of color. This can't be right, she whispered. Oh, it's right, Margaret said. And legally binding. The room fell silent. Even the agents behind us stopped pretending to work. Then came the tax records, the insurance, the utility statements, the trust documents, and finally, the life insurance beneficiary form. With each page, Victoria's expression collapsed further. By the end, she looked like someone who'd just realized the ground beneath her feet wasn't ground at all. It was water, and she was sinking fast. She lifted her eyes to me, small, vulnerable. Tom, why didn't you tell me? She asked. Because, I said softly, I wanted to see who you were when you thought you had power. And there it was, silent truth, sharp as glass. Her lip trembled. What happens now? She whispered. Now, I said. You face the consequences of your assumptions. Her colleagues watched, stunned, unsure whether to look away or keep observing the drama. Sensing the weight of the silence, Margaret stepped forward. Victoria, she said, you have 30 days to vacate the property. The same courtesy you gave Tom. Victoria's eyes filled, panic, regret, disbelief. I didn't know, she said weakly. I swear I didn't know. You didn't ask, I said. And those 4 words, simple, truthful, devastating, landed harder than anything else I could have said. Victoria covered her mouth, stunned. The facade she'd worn for years cracked so quickly, it was almost painful to watch. But truth doesn't negotiate. Truth stands. Truth stays. And today, truth had finally arrived. The moment Margaret finished speaking, the entire office felt like it was holding its breath. Phones rang unanswered. Papers froze mid-air. Even the hum of the copy machine seemed to die. Victoria stood there, motionless, her fingers trembling slightly as she clutched the edge of her desk. Her voice, once sharp enough to slice through any conversation, now sounded like a whisper trying to survive a storm. 30 days? She repeated, eyes wide. Margaret nodded calmly. Yes, effective today. Victoria looked around helplessly, as if someone in the room might step in and save her. But no one moved. Not one colleague defended her. Not after everything she'd claimed about me. Not after the truth laid itself out like an open book for everyone to read. Jessica, the blonde agent from Sunday, shifted uncomfortably, her eyes bouncing between the documents and Victoria's face. Only days earlier, she'd been admiring Victoria's future kitchen remodel. Now she looked embarrassed to have even stood in that conversation. Victoria swallowed hard, voice cracking. Tom, I didn't mean to disrespect you. I truly thought. You assumed, I said quietly, finishing the sentence she couldn't. Her lips quivered. I did. I assumed a lot, but I didn't know. I swear I didn't. You didn't ask, I repeated, my voice even, steady. You talked, you ordered, you criticized. You made decisions for me, not with me. You treated me like a weight. Her eyes filled. I was grieving too, she murmured. I wasn't thinking clearly. Margaret stepped forward again. Grief doesn't justify cruelty. Victoria closed her eyes as if the words had physically struck her. Her shoulders slumped, the confident posture gone. I'm sorry, she whispered. I nodded, not out of forgiveness, but acknowledgement. She had spoken the truth for the first time. Tom, she said shakily, is there any way we can work out something different? Some kind of arrangement? I felt every gaze in the room settle on me. The quiet old man in the worn suit. The man Victoria told everyone was living on his son's charity. The man she called a burden. I met her eyes. Respect isn't negotiable, I said softly. Victoria stared at me, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked genuinely lost. Broken, even. Margaret closed the portfolio. That's all for today, she said. Victoria, you'll receive official documents outlining the timeline and process. Victoria wiped her eyes quickly, pretending not to notice the agents watching. She straightened her hair, cleared her throat, and tried to pull together what remained of her dignity. But it was too late. Public illusions crumble fast, especially when built on assumptions. Margaret and I walked out. Behind us, I heard murmurs, quiet, shocked whispers that followed Victoria like a shadow she'd never escape. Outside the office, cold air brushed my face the moment we stepped into the sunlight. I inhaled deeply, letting the crisp November air settle into my lungs. The sky was still gray, but lighter now, like a storm passing. Margaret paused beside me. You handled that with more grace than most people would. Grace, I said slowly. It wasn't about that. It was about truth. She nodded. Still, you could have chosen anger. You chose facts. That's what quiet people do, I said. We wait until the noise dies down, then we speak. She smiled. David used to say the same thing about you. A warmth bloomed in my chest, one that hurt and healed at the same time. Tomorrow, Margaret continued, I'll file the formal tenant notice. She'll be out in 30 days. You have my word. I nodded. Thank you. She hesitated. Tom, you've carried this alone for weeks. That's not easy. I've carried heavier, I replied. Still, she said softly, you shouldn't forget to rest. I exhaled, long and slow. I will, after all this is over. We parted ways in the parking lot. I sat in my Honda for a long moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at the building where the truth finally spoke louder than lies. Then I turned on the engine and drove home. Back at the house. When I opened the door, the house felt different. Not physically, nothing had changed, but spiritually. The weight that had pressed on my chest for 2 months felt lighter, airier. Victoria had tried to erase this home's history, but she couldn't erase the truth. I walked into the kitchen. The sink was clean, the counters clear, but there was a manila folder sitting on the table, Victoria's folder from earlier that morning. She had left it behind. Inside were her notes, estimated expenses, projected budgets, a list titled "After Tom Moves Out." A sting of anger flickered through me. Not because of the notes, not anymore, but because of the arrogance behind them. She had written my future for me, without asking me a single question. I closed the folder. No one writes my story but me. I placed it aside and made myself a cup of tea. The kettle whistled, steaming up the quiet kitchen. For a moment I saw Margaret, my wife, leaning against the counter as she used to, humming while she waited for water to boil. The memory warmed me. Margaret would have laughed at today, I murmured. Then softly, she would have been proud. The gossip begins. By evening, Helen Davis, my neighbor for 37 years, knocked on my door with her usual starter. "Tom, you better sit down for this." I let her in. She set 2 cups of coffee on the table and lowered her voice. "So," she said, leaning in like she was about to reveal national secrets. "Apparently, what happened at Premier Realty spread like wildfire." I raised an eyebrow. "Wildfire?" "Tom, the entire real estate circle knows. There are Facebook posts, group texts. Even my sister called me asking if it was true." "What part?" "That Victoria called you a burden, publicly, while trying to evict the actual homeowner, who she thought was broke." I sighed, rubbing my forehead. Helen continued, eyes wide. "And then you and your lawyer walked into her office and showed them documents proving she had no claim to the house?" "That's accurate. Tom, people are calling it the Maple Street fallout." I blinked. "They named it?" "Oh yes. Real estate agents have no shame. They love drama more than commissions." Despite myself, I laughed. The first real laugh I'd had in months. Helen's face softened. "Tom, she did this to herself." "I know. She treated you like something disposable, and now she's the one paying for it." I didn't reply. Not because she was wrong, but because some truths sit heavy even when they're deserved. Helen reached out and squeezed my hand. "You did the right thing." I nodded slowly. "It wasn't revenge." "No," she said. "It was accountability." "Exactly." The call from Margaret. The next morning, Margaret phoned again. "Tom, there's something you should know." "What is it?" "Victoria hired an attorney." I sighed. "Of course she did. He's proposing a settlement." "What kind?" "She wants to stay in the house for 6 months instead of 30 days. I felt my jaw tighten. "She'll pay rent," Margaret added. $2,000 a month." $2,000. For a house with a market value of $420,000? It was laughable. "What did you say?" I asked. "That we'd consider reasonable offers." "And what's reasonable?" "Market value," she said. "About $3,500 a month, first and last month up front, and a security deposit. So $10,500. "Correct." I smiled faintly. "She won't agree to that." "I don't think so either," Margaret replied. "What then?" "Then she moves out." I nodded. "Good." The cracks widened later that afternoon. Someone else came to my door. Mike, my son's old college friend. He looked ashamed. "Tom, I owe you an apology," he began. "For what?" I asked. "For believing Victoria." He shifted his weight, avoiding my eyes. "She told us, me, the guys, that David was supporting you financially, that you couldn't manage on your own, and we believed her. I crossed my arms. Why? He sighed. Because it seemed plausible. We never asked. We assumed, and that was wrong. I didn't reply immediately. I just studied him. People see what they expect, and assumptions spread faster than truth. But Mike wasn't malicious. He was just guilty of the same casual ignorance that so many carry. I appreciate you coming, I finally said. He nodded gratefully. If you need anything at all, you call me. After he left, I stood for a moment by the door, letting the silence settle. Victoria hadn't just misjudged me. She'd misled others, shaped opinions, painted a story around herself. And now that story was unraveling. And then, the final blow, Saturday morning, Margaret called once more. Tom, it's done. What is? Victoria's attorney contacted me. She can't afford market rent. She's leaving the house. I exhaled, a long, steady breath. And there's more, Margaret said carefully. She's leaving her job at Premier Realty. Leaving, or being asked to leave. Mutual decision, she said, but you and I both know what that means. I closed my eyes. Victoria had lost her house, her job, her social standing, her assumptions, and her illusions. Do you feel guilty? Margaret asked. No, I said softly. I feel sad. For her? No, for the way she chose to be. Where part 5 begins. The house grew quiet again that night, a peaceful quiet, a healing quiet, a quiet that felt earned. But the story wasn't over. Not yet. Because sometimes consequences aren't the end. Sometimes reflection is, and Victoria still had something to say before leaving for good. The day Victoria finally came to pack her things, the sky was clear for the first time in weeks. Sunlight spilled across the lawn, warming the porch steps and casting long shadows that stretched all the way to the mailbox. It was the kind of peaceful morning you'd think belonged to a quiet neighborhood, not the closing act of a storm that had rattled every corner of this house. I heard her car pull up, slowly, hesitantly. When I peeked through the window, she was sitting behind the wheel, gripping it as if she wasn't sure she was ready to step out. A few seconds passed before she finally opened the door. She looked different, not polished, not sharp, not armored in expensive outfits and clipped authority. Instead, she wore plain jeans and a sweater too big for her, hair pulled back loosely, eyes swollen from days of crying or nights without sleep. Maybe both. She walked up the driveway with small, unsure steps. I opened the door before she could knock. Her voice was soft when she spoke. Tom, I'm here for my things. I nodded and stepped aside. They're where you left them. She walked past me slowly, her gaze lowered, the clack of her boots, a sound that once felt loud enough to shake the walls, was now small, almost apologetic. In the living room, boxes sat neatly stacked, labeled by the movers who had come earlier in the week. She stared at them for a long moment before touching the nearest one. I didn't expect it to feel this strange, she whispered. It's change, I said. It always feels strange. She swallowed hard and looked at me, really looked, like she hadn't done once since David passed. Tom, before I go, I need to say something. I waited. She set her hands on the back of the couch, grounding herself. I'm sorry, she said, voice trembling. For all of it. For the comments. For the assumptions. For trying to make decisions about your life like I had the right to. I thought I knew the situation. I thought I understood everything. And I was so wrong. Her breath hitched. And I'm sorry for how I spoke to you at the funeral. You didn't deserve that. No one does. I said nothing. Sometimes silence is kinder than words. She continued softly. I lost David. You lost him too. But instead of grieving with you, I pushed you out. I pushed everyone out. Because anger was easier than sadness. Her eyes glistened. And when I saw you just quietly accepting what I said, I thought you were weak. But you weren't. You were strong in a way I didn't understand. I took a slow breath. Victoria, I said gently, grief makes people do things they regret. But regret doesn't fix choices. Accountability does. She nodded, small and slow. I know, she said. The morning light caught the side of her face as she whispered, I hurt you, and I don't expect forgiveness. But I want you to know, I see myself clearly now. And it isn't pretty. Her voice broke. But I'm trying to change. I have to. For the first time, I saw her not as the woman who tried to erase me, but as someone who was breaking, rebuilding, learning. Pain can teach people the truth about themselves the way comfort never can. I nodded gently. I don't hate you, Victoria. She blinked, surprised. You don't? No, I said softly. But I hope you learn from this, and I hope you treat the next person in your life with the respect you forgot to give me. She pressed her lips together, fighting tears. I will. We stood in silence for a few seconds. Then she wiped her eyes and turned toward the boxes. I'll be out of your way soon, she said. Take your time, I replied. She packed quietly. No muttering, no frustration, no complaints. She moved through the hallways slower than she ever had, pausing at family photos, the kitchen doorway, the staircase. Maybe she was remembering. Maybe she was grieving. Maybe she was simply realizing that this home had never been hers to claim. 1 hour later, she carried the last box to her car. Before closing the trunk, she turned back to me. I loved him, she said, in my own flawed way. I know, I replied. And he loved you, she added. He always talked about how strong you were. I should have remembered that. She opened her car door. Goodbye, Tom. Goodbye, Victoria. She got in, started the engine, and drove away slowly down Maple Street, turning left at the end of the block without looking back. I stood on the porch until her car disappeared. The wind rustled the leaves around me, and for the first time in a long while, the house felt like mine again. Not just legally, but emotionally, spiritually, completely. The aftermath. In the weeks that followed, the house grew quiet in a peaceful way. Not the lonely quiet of grief, but the healing kind. The kind where sunlight looks warmer, dust motes float slower, and even the creaks in the floorboards sound like familiar voices. Neighbors checked on me more often. Friends visited. Mike came by and helped fix the back fence. Helen brought casseroles I didn't need, but appreciated. Life slowly rebuilt itself, piece by piece. And one Saturday morning, while cleaning the basement, I found something I hadn't expected. An old wooden box David made in high school. Inside it was a note from him, written years ago. Dad, thanks for teaching me what strength looks like. It hit me harder than anything Victoria ever said. I sat on the basement step for several minutes, holding that note, realizing that nothing Victoria assumed about me mattered. My son had known who I was. My wife had known. And now I knew too. Not weak, not dependent, not a burden, solid, steady, quietly strong. The kind of strength that doesn't shout, it just stands. The final confrontation, unexpected. 2 months later, I ran into Victoria again, by complete accident, outside a coffee shop downtown. She looked healthier, calmer, a little older, but in the way grief ages you into someone wiser. She approached me slowly. "I got a new job," she said. "Different field, smaller paycheck, but it's honest work." I nodded. "Good. And I'm seeing a counselor," she added shyly, "trying to be better." I could hear the sincerity, and sincerity, even late, is worth acknowledging. "You're on the right path," I said. She smiled, just barely. "Thank you for not destroying me when you had every reason to." "It wasn't about revenge," I replied. "It was about truth." Her eyes softened, and the truth changed me. Then it did its job. We parted with a quiet nod, two people closing a difficult chapter with something close to grace. Looking back, I learned something I wish I'd understood years ago. People don't define you. Their assumptions don't shape you. Their disrespect doesn't diminish you. Your truth is yours, even when others fail to see it. And sometimes, standing firm, quietly, calmly, confidently, is the most powerful thing a person can do. Because dignity doesn't shout. Dignity stands. Thanks for listening to this story. If it moved you, hit that like button. It genuinely helps the channel grow. Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe for more stories like this.